chapter 11 was about growing an innovation culture. And this is probably my favorite section on the book. I feel like every time I give a tech talk or doing consulting with senior executives, I talk about Theory X and Theory Y and the NUMMI model for change. So um, just to recap, there's Theory X, some permutation of like, hey, people are inherently lazy, unambitious, and they just want job security. And people that ascribe to this theory typically take on management tactics that are described as carrots and sticks. Um, Not that I'm against like incentives and disincentives per se, but like that's what they put at the forefront. Versus theory Y is that people could and would link their own goals to those of the organization. So, if you want people to do great things, don't talk to them about building boats, just teach them to yearn for the sea. If anybody's familiar with that little excerpt from the Netflix Culture Guide. So, the thing that I think that Toyota in the NUMMI model figured out, I actually refer to this as the NUMMI maneuver. I don't know if I think I might have made that up at some point. I hope it takes off. Not unlike the stories that you hear described for Conway's Law and the inverse Conway maneuver, is the way that you change culture isn't by changing how people think, but instead how they behave. And when they see the results in behaving or working in a different way, that's actually what changes their culture. And you can contrast that with military culture. And I think this is prevalent in the wider federal government and even in the Fortune 500. It's like if we need to talk to people about a cultural issue, even something as serious as like sexual harassment, what we're going to do is put computer-based trainings in front of them and have them click through a bunch of slides that tell them how they should think about the issue and expect that that's going to somehow change the way people behave. And that never works. And in the Toyota story, in the Toyota story, GM had the worst performing plant in the United States. It was called the Fremont Assembly, which, fun fact, is now the site of Tesla, at least for now. They might leave, I don't know. Um, but it was a joint venture between GM and Toyota, and um, it was so bad people were drinking and gambling on the job, sabotaging vehicles, and instead of like taking on the union to get new employees, Toyota just said, no, have them come out to Toyota in Japan and come work with us in a different way. And when those people saw the results of working in a different way, they came back to the United States and were just like, there's no zealot like a convert is a way to describe it. They became zealots for this. And within 3 months, it became the highest performing manufacturing plant in the United States. In fact, its performance was never replicated until it shuttered its doors in the 2008 crisis. So GM was never actually able to replicate just how good they were. So really powerful story of change. And by the way, if you love that story, there's a This American Life podcast episode that just talks about NUMMI. And it's a great one to share with like senior executives and upper management if you're struggling with this kind of aspect of transformation. Like there's two aspects of culture. Every culture exists actually to produce outcomes and specifically outcomes that that group of humans values. And so, in a lot of ways, one way to like, there's two aspects of culture. Is like, do people like the culture? So there's like a satisfaction. How does it make you feel? But also, that culture has to produce the outcomes that you're aiming at. And so, as a twofold measurement, is like if the culture is a good one, we should see outcomes in the form of the things that we value. Maybe it's improved mission performance in the government, and happy employees. So there's like a NPS team health aspect and are we doing the thing we said we were going to do, shipping software and producing mission results. So I think that's really important that you measure both. We have a saying at Rise8, we do this thing called Prod Hall where we talk about outcomes that have been shipped to prod. And at the beginning of it, there's this quote. We say it every single time, even though everybody is probably tired of hearing it at this point. It's like, at Rise8, you're responsible for two things: outcomes in prod and happy customers. And it's like, both of those things have to be true. You can produce outcomes and people would be really unhappy, and vice versa. People could be really happy and you're not producing outcomes. You have to find the intersection of both. So I think two things that have been eye-opening for me, because I used to wonder when I was, military using terrible software and transitioning over to acquisitions and software procurement, like, can these people actually change? And I think what I've learned is you can. It's a huge investment. So for us, as more like digital natives, let's just focus on getting it right up front. But I used to think like, oh man, we might have to get rid of a bunch of people, like a bunch of government civilians and military folks. But certainly there are some, I think it's like on the edge of the bell curve though, like a less than 5%. I think there's a lot more people that can transform than we realize through this model of change what they do and do it in ways that very quickly produce results. And I think that going back to some of the earlier book club conversations about having a path to prod and being able to demonstrate outcomes in production very early and often becomes a really powerful way to then take employees and actually change their culture, something I used to think might not be possible. And the NUMMI example of people who were drinking and gambling on the job and sabotaging vehicles, 3 months later, highest performing plant in the United States, same people, right? What changed? The systems of work and the management. And
Yeah.
I think there's a like powerful journey there. It's in fact, I've been on this train lately of the fact that you can't customer discover your way into a vision. I think similarly, when you're building a company or an organization, if we're talking about a government program office, uh, you can't employee discover your way to a culture. You have to have a vision for it up front. And obviously you test that against employees and like that's where the interaction needs to come with. But I think much like what happens in product, instead of validating a vision against the customer, they try to use the customer inputs to become the vision, and that almost never works. And I think there's no substitute for strong vision in culture and in product. And so and surveys are dangerous in both scenarios if you misuse and abuse them. So it's a really, really poignant thing. One last thing I'll say is this is maybe like a little bit more controversial, and something that I've been challenged on recently is um, about culture fit. And I think, again, certainly it's a huge investment. So there's always a question of, is the juice worth the squeeze, or the amount of effort we would have to put into an individual? Like, is there good ROI for the organization and the mission on it? But even complex things like things you might call character traits like charisma is actually just a placeholder that we use for a whole bunch of skills, right? And if you force yourself to think that way, then you break it down and you're like, what is charisma? It's like, oh, well, smiling when you walk into a room and having open body language. And you could go down the list of like all of these things you can do to be more charismatic. And it's like, okay, well, I can train each one of those things. I think the problem is it's a grouping of them. You have to be good at like 10 or 15 skills to be considered, charismatic. So it's much harder to train than like software delivery skill, where I can just be like, go do this. It's like, I need you to work on 15 different things. And maybe we take them one at a time, but it's like, okay, if I wanted to train somebody to become more charismatic, it's like, okay, today we're going to work on smiling when you walk into the room. We're at a big conference. Every time you walk in, I want you to smile and make eye contact with people. And so there was I think it was actually Alex Hormozy that's been talking about this a lot lately. I follow some of his content, and it really challenged my notions of, I used to say like, oh yeah, like charisma, like sure, maybe you can make somebody marginally better, but people are either charismatic or they're not. And it's like, no, it's just a collection of skills that you can train. And so if you can train that, I feel like almost everything we call culture is actually a set of behaviors underneath of which is a complex set of skills. And if you really want to, you can train it. It's just a question of like, is it an investment you want to make?